Chapter 9. After a reckless drive across the Brooklyn Bridge and round the top of Manhattan, Alan skidded up outside the police station he had been summoned to and double-parked an empty patrol car. Jumping out, he ripped off his bandage and briefly examined his wound in the wing mirror. Then he flung the bandage into the gutter, dived over the back of the police car, and nearly flattened a passerby on the sidewalk as he bounded up the steps and through the doors of the precinct headquarters. Inside, he ran up more stairs and finally abrupted into the long, low office. "Hey, pardon me, excuse me, hey, officer, sir," Alan shouted, leaning over the counter and dancing impatiently from foot to foot. Officer Lewandowski had been on the point of dragging the woman with no license plates and every excuse under the sun for not having any across the counter and throttling her. "Okay, mister, take it easy. What do you want?" he replied, grateful for the interruption. "Bauer. My name is Alan Bauer. You called me a few minutes ago?" Lewandowski's face fell. He had been hoping for a homicide at least. He turned to the busy personnel in the office behind him. "Did any of you guys call for an Alan Bauer?" he yelled. "Oh, yeah, it's for the dumb blonde," called a young gum-chewing officer. He came out, opened the counter flap, and led Alan into the waiting room. An assortment of drunks, druggies, bag ladies, and hookers was lounging in the small, smoke-filled room. Alan glanced at the officer in confusion as he beckoned someone out of the crowd, but his face flickered rapidly from dismay through astonishment to a sunrise of delighted recognition as the girl in the Miss Liberty t-shirt walked over to him, smiling. She put her arms around his neck and devoured his readily yielding lips with hungry eagerness. When she had finished, Alan could only gaze at her, utterly oblivious of his surroundings and aware only of her fathomless blue eyes and the mysterious scent of her lithe, bronzed body. "Hi," he breathed at last, his mouth not moving. Work in the precinct office had come to a complete stop. Lewandowski walked over to them, uncertain how to proceed. "I take it you know this girl, Mr. Bauer?" Alan's eyes were fixed on hers. "Yeah, I do," he murmured, his mouth still scarcely moving. "Who the hell is she?" Lewandowski demanded, glancing down at the charge book he had picked up off the counter. "I don't know," Alan said, his mouth now mobile again. Lewandowski nodded. "Of course," he shrugged. The girl drew Alan's head towards her and kissed him again freely and passionately in front of the spellbound crowd of cops and vagrants. "Miss Liberty," Alan whispered. "Oh, God, oh, God, oh, God," as the girl put her thigh between his and moved her leg gently against him. He closed his eyes and clung helplessly to her waist, his face buried in her hair. Suddenly Alan's hand was seized and the damp wallet was pressed into his limp grasp. "Get out of here, both of you," Lewandowski snarled. With the fruit and vegetable trade light years from his mind, Alan drove Miss Liberty to his apartment block in the East 60s. Her smiling silence did not worry him. He was too confused and nervous himself for that. Glancing sideways at her radiant face, he was struck by her insatiable interest in everything she saw as she stared around her, frowning and laughing like a child at the traffic, the buildings, and the people. The events of the previous day still seemed like a dream to him, but now he was not so sure. And if it was all a dream, he certainly did not want to wake up ever again. Tim, the liveried doorman, looked surprised to see him as he handed the outlandishly attired beauty onto the sidewalk. "Good afternoon, Mr. Bauer. You're home early today." "Yeah," Alan grinned. He showed the way through the revolving door, and the girl went right round in it and re-emerged on the sidewalk, puzzled and laughing. Alan came back out through the door to greet her. "Yeah, that door? It spins, see? It spins round." He turned to Tim. "Get this door fixed, Timmy," he ordered, ushering the girl back inside. While they waited in the spacious lobby for the elevator, Alan greeted some passing neighbors with forced casualness as the girl suddenly threw her arms round his neck, pressing her firm, pointed breasts into his chest. Once again, she fed hungrily on his strong, well-shaped mouth, running her hands through his hair and stirring her thigh against his hip. Alan gently tried to restrain her until the elevator arrived. When it did, she pulled him inside the car, and even before the doors had closed, she unbuttoned the top of his shirt and began to caress and lick his throat and neck. Alan tried to think of some distraction to stop himself from succumbing to the overwhelming desires her onslaught provoked in him. He prayed that the elevator would not stop on its way to his floor as his body began to melt and flow in the whirlpool of surging passion that her presence created around him. Wrapped in Alan's bathrobe, Miss Liberty gazed around the large, tastefully appointed apartment with wonder and pleasure. She spent a long time at the circular porthole in the wall, behind which multicolored fish swam and peered into the room with distorted, globular faces. She stroked the glass lovingly, puzzled by the transparent barrier and the untouchable water. She found a glazed conch shell on a shelf of the room divider and caressed it, holding it to her cheek and listening to its hollow silence. From the kitchen, Alan's light, tenor voice endlessly sang the same few phrases in full-throated happiness. "Oh, what a wonderful morning! Oh, what a beautiful day!" He came in carrying a fully laden tray balanced on the palm of one hand, bent back over the shoulder like a flamboyant waiter. "I didn't know what you liked, so I got you a choice," he announced with a brilliant smile. "You got here pancakes, omelets, toast, fruit, juice." As he put the tray down on a low table, the girl clung round his neck, kissing his eyes and hair and opening the front of his rumpled shirt. No, no, no," he laughed uneasily, unwrapping her arms and leading her over to sit on the huge bed. "I have to get back to work now," he told her gently, kissing her forehead. He leaned across and switched on the television set. "There, that'll keep you company while I'm gone." Alan picked up his tie from the floor and started knotting it. "Now, when I come home from work in a couple of hours, we'll go out and get us some dinner," he promised her, pulling on his corduroy jacket, "and we'll also pick up some clothes for you. Not that you don't look spectacular in my bathrobe." He bent down and kissed her again. She reached up and pulled him over the top of her, twining her long, slim legs around his. Alan struggled to free himself, but she smiled seductively and kissed him over and over again, tugging at his tie and shirt buttons. "Bye-bye now," he murmured. "Come on now, baby, you're going to put me in a hospital." He finally got to his feet and glanced at his watch. "Gee, it's gone 3 already. I really do have to get back to work now. You were just wonderful. Bye-bye." Alan went out and shut the door. The girl sat disconsolately on the edge of the unmade bed, staring at the television screen. On it, a man was riding a horse furiously across a desert. Slowly she leaned forward and touched the screen tentatively with her fingertips. The tingle of static made her flinch away in alarm. She looked at the tray full of food and was about to go over to it when the door suddenly burst open again. Alan rushed back into the apartment, ripping off his jacket and tie and throwing off his shoes. "Actually, things don't really get started down at the market until 4 o'clock, he panted, kneeling over her thighs and sinking forward slowly as their lips closed in a long, wild kiss. Her hands tore at his shirt and dug into his back, and Alan pulled her breasts out of the robe and kissed them through the cascade of thick, blonde hair. Elated at the prospect of a lucrative deal with buy-right supermarkets, Freddie was presiding over an endless parade of onions passing on a conveyor belt and being picked over by a bored bunch of young employees. Though puzzled by Alan's strange manner and abrupt behavior, Freddie was reveling in his new status and acting in a more and more proprietorial style around the wharf. Now, let's not be too choosy with these onions. Come on, you guys, some of these are perfectly good onions, he argued as a clutch of bad ones rumbled past him. Hey, careful with those turnips, he yelled as somebody dropped a tray of mangoes nearby. Just then, a bright yellow electric trolley zigzagged across the wharf and whined to a stop among the crated fruit. Zip, zippity-doo-dah, sang Alan boisterously, leaping off the trolley and skipping into the warehouse like a kid in a chorus line. Hey, Manuel, my, oh my, what a wonderful day. Freddie waddled out to see what was going on. Plenty of sunshine heading my way, crooned Alan, chucking a burly middle-aged wharfie under the chin. Zippity-doo-dah. He seized a bruised mango, balanced it on his shoulder, and danced his way across to his dumbfounded brother. Mr. Mango on my shoulder, he giggled, taking Freddie's podgy hands and whirling him round and round. Come on, Freddie, dance with me. Freddie lumbered awkwardly round, looking extremely uncomfortable. Oh, wait, he muttered. Hey, Alan, not in front of the teamsters. Alan tossed the mango to the watching wharfies. Hey, they're happy guys, he cried. We're all happy guys. You're a rotten lead, Freddie protested, standing still while Alan pranced on solo, shouting and yodeling and clapping his hands above his head. Listen, Alan, I got the buy-right contracts already. You want to check them out? Freddie bleated, trailing after his jitter-bugging brother. Alan snatched up some spotty potatoes and started juggling them, still dancing among the bemused employees. No, 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 you check 'em out, Freddie. You know the business, he sang recklessly. Freddie looked around the cluttered warehouse, grinning like a child with a bag of candy. Oh, so I'm in charge, he cried. Sure you are, Freddie. But what about the lawyers' meeting tonight at 8? Freddie asked anxiously, beginning to feel a little out of his depth. Alan spun round and round, still juggling the sick potatoes, and headed towards the stairs. 8? 8 p.m.? No, that's too late for me, he protested. Listen, Freddie, I'm going to take a nap. He flipped the potatoes one by one to the open-mouthed Jerry. Handle these for me, baby, he said, hopping up the stairs like a hare and laughing hysterically. You guys just wake me when it's time to go home, he shouted, and slammed the office door. For a while, Freddie just stood there, stunned. He had not bargained for being left quite so completely in charge of Ralph Bauer and Sons. It was obviously going to be more complicated than he had realized. He waved the warehouse back to work and started to climb the stairs to the office. Chapter 10. Back in Alan's apartment, Miss Liberty was sitting naked on the bed, the remains of her brunch scattered over the low table. Occasionally she looked longingly over at the circular aquarium and the dazzling fish, but mostly she just stared in rapt fascination at the TV screen as the late afternoon sun slatted through the half-open blinds. Anne Klein, Bloomingdale's. Anne Klein, insisted the TV voice, as a succession of women in a variety of attire paraded up and down in front of even more women dressed in stylish clothes. Miss Liberty glanced down at her own brown nakedness and then frowned back at the screen. At Bloomingdale's, raved the voiceover. Again she looked down at herself. Then she gazed at the Miss Liberty t-shirt lying crumpled in the corner of the room, then back at the elegant models magically changing from outfit to outfit with effortless ease as they mysteriously dissolved one into another. She jumped up and ran over to the large wall closet opposite the bed. Sliding open the doors, she revealed Alan's extensive wardrobe neatly arranged on rails and shelves. At Bloomingdale's, sang the voices from the television persuasively. Tim, the doorman, did a startled double take as the apparition darted out of the revolving door onto the sidewalk. Then he recognized the tall beauty he had seen with Mr. Bauer earlier. She was wearing one of Alan's suits. The trousers were telescoped over her bare feet. The jacket sagged off the end of each shoulder, and the tie was scrappily knotted outside the flaps of the shirt collar. She hesitated at the curbside, glancing uncertainly up and down the street. Can I help you, miss? She stared at Tim silently. Then her full, blooming lips moved slightly, and she frowned, as if trying to remember something. "Can't you talk?" Tim asked. The sensuous mouth moved again, this time uttering a faint, unintelligible mumble. Tim pushed back his braided maroon cap and shook his head helplessly. Again the lovely mouth moved. "Bloomingdale's?" Tim grinned sunnily. "Oh, yeah, sure. Right away, ma'am." And he hailed a cab and ushered the strange girl into it with ceremonious courtesy. Outside Bloomingdale's, the girl got out of the taxi and left the door open as she turned to enter the bustling department store. "Hey there, miss!" yelled the cabbie, thrusting his large hand through the roll-down window. The girl looked blankly at his waggling fingers. Then she seemed to remember something. She reached into the suit, took out Alan's damp wallet, and handed it over. The driver took out his fare, plus a generous tip, and gave it back to her. Inside the huge store, the girl moved slowly among the counters as though in a dream. Everything she saw amazed, delighted, and attracted her. In the cosmetics department, she went up to the women shoppers and stared intently into their faces as they tried out the different products in front of adjustable mirrors. Oblivious of people's perplexed and occasionally resentful reactions, she moved happily through the store, gawping and fingering everything in sight. Eventually, she reached the fashion department. She climbed into a low plinth to examine an elegant dummy, caressing its clothes with murmurs of wonder. Then she wandered among the racks of dresses, feeling the fabrics and marveling at the variety of colors and styles. "Oh, my God!" cried Mrs. Dora Klein, the short, 50-year-old department manageress, running over to the odd-looking customer. "Darling, darling, darling, that outfit is to die from," she exclaimed, looking the girl up and down through her diamante glasses attached to a cord round her neck. "What happened, darling? You saw Annie Hall 100 times. That look is over." The girl smiled placidly back at her, looking critically at Mrs. Klein's frothy red and white spotted blouse and dark tailored costume with long skirts slit to the knee. Then she went over to a nearby rack and picked out a dress at random. "You want to try that on?" asked Dora helpfully, patting her highly styled hairdo as she passed a mirror. "Let me assist you. Who knows? Maybe it's you. It isn't me. I couldn't get one leg in there. My daughter, on the other hand, is lucky. She's anorexic." Chattering away, Mrs. Klein led the girl over to the cubicles. An hour later, the exhausted woman handed the girl an assortment of bags and packages, together with Alan's wallet, now a little drier, but also rather thinner than before. "Please call again soon, darling," she invited her. "And why don't you do yourself a favor and stop by the lingerie? A pretty girl like you shouldn't be wearing boxer shorts." Now wearing a loose pale blue dress with attached scarf and a pair of squashy white turnover boots, the girl waved goodbye and resumed her wide-eyed exploration of the Aladdin's cave and its seductive treasures. In the TV department, she dropped her purchases on the floor and ran over to the dozens of television sets ranged along the wall, all showing different channels and cable or movie programs. She darted from screen to screen, devouring the endless images with hungry eyes and listening intently to the babble of unfamiliar and incomprehensible sounds. "Colgate Winter Fresh Gel. And now we continue with Capital. It's crazy at his greatest clearance sale ever. It's crazy and he's slashing prices. Stereo equipment, video equipment, telephone equipment, car stereo equipment, disco equipment, all with full manufacturer's warranty. Most prices below cost. It's Crazy Eddie at his greatest sale ever at these 12 great locations: Manhattan, the Bronx, Brooklyn, Union, Westchester, Norwalk, Westbury, going on right now at prices that are insane." Miss Liberty watched the frenetic presenter miming manically to the strident announcements. She watched chasing cars leaping across swing bridges, strings of brilliantly flashing lights surrounding quiz show competitors, men on horses shooting other men on horses, old people in wheelchairs getting up and walking into the arms of praying blue-suited evangelists, children talking to giant chickens and frogs, and she was quite unaware of the immaculately dressed salesman watching her in astonishment as she flitted from set to set, miming and mouthing and more uttering odd words and phrases back at the inexhaustible screens. Alan bounded out of the elevator and hopped along the hallway, singing and flourishing a large bunch of roses. Zippity-doo-dah, hello, I'm home, he shouted, opening the front door and dancing into his apartment like a Gene Kelly hero. Seconds later, he flew back out the door and, punching both elevator buttons on opposite sides of the hallway, he poised himself midway between them, silent and deathly pale. When the first car arrived, he sprang into it and shot down to the lobby. Tim was amazed to see him back outside so soon. I'm looking for a girl, Timmy. $200. Alan looked rather frightened. No, the one I came in with this afternoon. Remember? The blonde. Tim nodded slyly. Oh, yeah, I put her in a cab. Alan grabbed Tim's gold-braided lapels. To where? Where to, Timmy? Where? He shouted frantically. Tim thought for a moment. Yeah, I remember. Bloomingdale's. Alan was gone at once. Dicing with death, he raced into the street and flailed at a passing cab. Halt! Stop! Hey, taxi, please! He screamed as the traffic swerved and skidded round him on either side. What seemed to Alan a lifetime later, he flung some cash at the driver and bolted into the entrance of Bloomingdale's. Sir, we're just closing, sir, yelled a commissioner, making a grab for him inside the doors among the milling crowd. I know, Alan yelled back, diving for the stairs. Just give me 3 minutes. Come back, sir. 3 minutes. You can time me. Alan screamed back over his shoulder, flying up the wide staircase 3 at a time like some record-seeking Olympic athlete. Up in the television department, Miss Liberty was stretching and bending in front of the screens, her eyes glued to the Richard Simmons exercise show. Behind her at the counter, the respectable-looking manager and a young black salesman were watching her high, firm buttocks as she touched her toes energetically in time to the music throbbing from the speakers. She works hard for the money, so you better treat her right, sang the TVs, now all showing the same channel simultaneously. Come on, let's go, Simmons chanted, bullying his matronly studio participants with patronizing gaiety. The bespectacled manager cleared his throat reluctantly. Excuse me, miss, but we're about to close, he called out tentatively. The girl carried on reaching and stretching with disciplined regularity, completely ignoring him. She's been here for 6 hours, muttered the salesman out of the side of his mouth, without taking his eyes off the vision before him. Eventually, the manager walked up behind the girl. Excuse me, miss, but I'm going to have to insist that you stop doing that, he declared firmly. She works hard for her money, pounded the speakers. The manager returned to the counter. She's exercising, he confided quietly, as though he were imparting a mysterious secret. We'll just give her a few more minutes. And they both watched with rapt attention. At last the manager walked slowly over to the sets and began to switch them off one by one, still eyeing the ravishing gymnast's performance with studied attention. Oh, thank God, cried Alan, rushing into the darkening department as the neon lights began to go out overhead. He swept Miss Liberty up in his arms and hugged her tightly, kissing her glowing cheeks and gazing into her surprised, delighted eyes with tearful relief. Murmuring softly, she bent forward and kissed his dark, moist eyelids. The manager approached. Do you know this woman, sir? He inquired officiously. Yeah, I do, Alan replied without looking round, clinging possessively to her vibrant body. I just don't know what her name is, so don't ask me. Well, sir, we've been trying to explain to her that it's closing time, but she doesn't seem to understand. That's because she doesn't speak any English, Alan explained with exaggerated politeness, kissing her eyes tenderly. Hello, Alan. How was your day? Miss Liberty asked in a low, melodious voice with the tiniest trace of an accent. Alan let go of her and stepped back in amazement. "Excuse me," said the manager sarcastically. "I never went to college, but wasn't that English?" The girl turned to him. "Thank you for letting me use your television," she smiled. "It was very educational." The manager bowed and returned to the counter. Alan was still gaping at her. "What is your name?" he asked. "It is hard to say in English, Alan." Alan shrugged. "Well, just say it in your language," he suggested. She nodded. "All right. My name is—" An unbearable, non-human sound of piercing, high-pitched intensity sliced through the air from the girl's parted lips. Alan and the two salesmen clapped their hands over their ears, wincing with pain as the fearful noise exploded inside their heads. At the same time, the television screens exploded in showers of powdery glass, spraying sharp splinters in all directions. In the shocked silence which followed, the three men glanced at each other in horrified disbelief, and then stared round speechless at the devastation. Slowly the manager and the salesman approached the wrecked shelves, gesticulating in futile bewilderment. Alan pulled himself together and galvanized into action. He swept the girl's packages up off the floor and grabbed her arm. "Well, how about these dumb blondes?" he exclaimed with a nervous laugh. Then he dragged her out of the department, down the staircase, and out into the street. Chapter 11. Alan marched the girl briskly along the avenue, struggling to cope with the burden of packages she had accumulated during the afternoon's raid on Bloomingdale's. "I'm a bit confused," he confessed. "I mean, why haven't you said a word to me until just back there in the store?" "I didn't know English," she said simply. "Oh, I see," Alan grunted, avoiding a lamppost. "And now you do?" "Yes, I learned this afternoon from television. It's wonderful. Now I can ask you lots of questions, and if you answer them correctly, you can win one of these valuable prizes." Alan glanced sidelong at the extraordinary creature, wondering whether he was not the victim of some fiendishly elaborate hoax. "An attractive wall clock, a matching washer and dryer set, or a brand new car," she recited with apparent innocence. Alan stopped her at a street corner where the lights were against them. "Wait a minute, let me go first," he protested, as the passers-by thronged around them and the bright lights flashed everywhere. "Just begin when you were born and finish up right when you blew up all the TVs." The sign changed from "Don't walk" to "Walk." Miss Liberty darted away from him and shined easily up the traffic signpost. "Pretty!" she exclaimed with childlike appreciation, fingering the buzzing green neon tubes. Alan gazed up at her and shook his head like an indulgent parent. "Yeah, I never really thought about it before," he agreed, frowning and smiling at the same time. "Are you from Cape Cod?" She jumped nimbly down, linked arms with him, and they walked on over the crossing. "No," she said after a while. "I come from another place." "Oh, yeah, I had a cousin from there," Alan retorted satirically. "Are you an American?" She laughed tantalizingly, kissing his ear. "No." "So why are you at Cape Cod? Why are you in New York, and why did the cops find you naked?" Alan persevered. They were just passing three Negroes playing jazz in a doorway. The girl broke away again and ran over to them excitedly. "What's that?" she asked. Alan joined her warily. "The music?" "Yes, music. I like it. I heard some on the television. Dance fever," she said, gyrating sinuously to and fro in front of the buskers. "Oh, I love you, girl," sang the banjo player, coiling his hips in time with hers. She gazed in fascination at the ridges of muscle rippling across the singer's bare stomach. Alan tugged anxiously at her sleeve. Hey, honey, we'd best get going or we'll be late," he told her firmly. "You never heard music before today?" She shook her head, laughing over her shoulder at the three black faces as Alan urgently walked her on. Then all at once something caught her roving eyes across the street. "What's that?" she cried, wriggling free and diving heedlessly into the busy traffic. Alan closed his eyes as the howl of horns and the screech of tires erupted all around him. There was a sickening crump and then a second one immediately afterwards. Alan opened his eyes. The girl was safe on the other side of the avenue, under the glittering canopy of a cinema, gazing at the lurid posters. "What the hell's that dame doing?" yelled an irate cab driver. "She could have got me killed," shouted another. Alan jumped over tangled fenders and reached the opposite sidewalk in a state of trembling collapse. "That's a movie theater," he gasped, clutching her shoulders and shaking like a leaf. Then he turned and faced the immobilized traffic. "Give her a break. She's from out of town," he spat blindly and savagely. "So why don't you keep her on a leash?" Yeah, and you have a nice day, too," Alan yelled. He propelled the girl away from the hooting, shouting melee, and they took refuge in a pizza parlor down the next side street. The girl watched mesmerized while the chef twirled the huge disk of dough in the air like a bullfighter wielding his cape. "Do you see that?" she recited. "It's wonderfully good for you, and it's so delicious, too." Alan glanced round through the window to check if they had been pursued, but there was no sign of a posse of angry cabbies. He turned to Miss Liberty. "Listen, while you're here, maybe you ought to watch a little less television," he advised her, an edge of impatience creeping into his normally gentle voice. "Anyhow, how long are you going to be in town?" She shook out her beautiful hair like a straw-colored flame. 6 fun-filled days. Alan's face fell a mile. "Oh, 6 days? Is that all?" 6 days, and the moon is full," she nodded. Alan pushed his face into her hair and drew her closer. The curve of her hips sent a tremor of desire through his body. The chef looked at them inquiringly. Alan grinned. Just looking," he muttered, and quickly steered the ravishing girl outside. "If I stay longer than 6 days, I can't ever go back," she murmured as they turned into the avenue again. "Oh, is there some kind of immigration problem?" asked Alan, deeply troubled by this unwelcome revelation. Then he noticed that she was holding a tin mug filled with pencils standing up on end. Where did you get that?" he demanded, taking it roughly from her. She pointed back towards the intersection where a blind man was feeling around in the air, his dark glasses flashing uselessly. Alan ran back and pressed the mug into the man's claw-like hand, mumbling an apology. Then he searched his pockets and put some change in the man's breast pocket. They walked on in silence for a while, Alan keeping his arm hooked firmly into hers and glancing covertly into the strangely radiant face with its fringe of tight corkscrew tresses. "You know, I'm going to have to call you something in English," he intimated shyly, after a long look at her finely chiseled profile. "I can't say your real name, whatever that was, back there in the store." "What are English names?" Alan frowned. "Well, there's millions of them, I guess. There's Jennifer, Joni, Hillary, Victoria." But she was distracted again, pulling eagerly towards a hot dog stand on a corner, attracted by the red-hot Coke brazier. "Hey, careful, those are hot," he warned her. "Let's see, there's Kim and Lindy. Hey, where are we now?" he suddenly exclaimed, glancing up at the street sign. "Ah, Madison," she smiled. "Madison?" "Madison Avenue." "Madison. I like Madison," she said, nuzzling his ear. Alan shrugged. "Well, you see, Madison's not a name." "Well, it is, but—" He stopped, completely at a loss, and smiled at her. "Okay, why not? Madison it is," he agreed. "Good thing we weren't at 149th Street, he laughed. Madison stopped and looked earnestly into his dark eyes. "Are we going back to where you live now?" she asked wistfully. Alan grinned wryly, as though he had been putting off broaching the subject himself for a considerable time. "Well, here's the thing," he mumbled. "I was going to find you a hotel." She looked at him blankly. "But then," he stumbled on, "then I figured that after this afternoon, well, I mean, I just kind of assumed that we'd—" He fell silent and gazed helplessly into her blue eyes. "Well, would you mind coming and staying with me?" he ended up weakly. Madison put her hand unashamedly between his taut thighs. "But I want to stay with you," she whispered. You are the reason I came here, Alan. Alan closed his eyes and gasped as Madison moved against him. She put her strong, slender arms round his neck and caressed his mouth with her tongue. Unaware of the traffic, the lights, the noise, the people, Alan buried his face in her breasts. That was a kiss, he murmured after a long silence. I know, Madison breathed, stroking his hair and looking up into the evening sky. Above them, the brilliant moon was just a little more than half full. That night, the moon was paler in the pre-dawn sky as Madison slipped quietly out of the bed, taking great care not to waken Alan. She looked tenderly down at his peaceful face and gently pulled the sheet over his naked torso. Then she waved affectionately to the watchful fish in their illuminated aquarium across the living room and glided noiselessly into the kitchen. She felt about in a cupboard, took out a packet, and crept along to the bathroom, turning on the light and locking the door behind her. With a tremor of excitement, she opened up the taps and tipped half the salt from the packet into the bathtub. Dimming the lights to just a faint glow, she climbed into the tub and lay back with her eyes closed as the warm water swirled higher and higher around her. Mysterious moods and feelings played over her face, and she uttered quiet little moans and gasps as the water rose. Then a commotion under the water prompted her to reach up and turn off the taps. A shudder passed through her golden body, and her breasts seemed to lift and swell slightly. Over the end of the bath, a broad-ribbed fin unfurled itself like two crescent-shaped wings and fanned out in iridescent splendor. Madison opened her eyes and gazed down happily at the delicate silver scales of her slim tail shimmering with brilliant rainbow hues in the frothing water. With a sigh of pleasure, she slid down the slope of the tub and put her head under the surface, so that her hair spread like a chaste veil over her lovely form. Alan stirred from his dream and woke. Madison, he murmured into the pillow, I had a dream that we... He sat up abruptly, peering at the rumpled empty space beside him. Madison, sweetheart? With a twinge of apprehension, Alan switched on the light and got up. The fish were watching him, mouthing their eternal silent message. Then he heard the splashing of water and went through to the bathroom. Madison? There was a pause and a splash. Alan? He relaxed a little. Yeah, of course it's Alan. What are you doing, sweetheart? I'm taking a bath. Memories of the earlier part of the night stirred Alan's body. Can I come in, honey? He murmured intimately through the door. No! Alan chuckled suggestively. Oh, why not, sweetheart? There was a louder splash and then a tremendous thump on the bathroom floor. Alan tried to open the door. What the hell was that? He cried. Madison! Madison, are you all right in there? There was another pause. Inside the bathroom, Madison was sitting on the bathrug, hastily dabbing at her tail with a towel. Everything's fine, she called. Well, then let me in, Alan told her, still uneasy. Madison continued to dry her tail and fin with hurried, panicky movements. I'll be right there, Alan. I'm just changing, she sang out reassuringly. Come on, Madison, open the door. Something is wrong, Alan shouted. Madison reached for the hairdryer on the wash basin unit and accidentally knocked a hairbrush into the sink with a clatter. Oh, Alan, could you make me some pancakes? Make you some? There was a sudden howl from the dryer as Madison desperately tried to dry her tail. Alan's voice became angry and determined. All right, Madison, either you open this door or I'm going to break it down, he threatened. This is just getting too scary. No, Alan, please don't come in, she pleaded, waving the dryer up and down her tail. Okay, that's it, Alan shouted, heaving his shoulder against the door. Madison grabbed the towel, covered her tail and fin, and started to dry her long hair with the dryer. Alan heaved again, and the lock broke off, and the door flew open. Madison looked meekly up at him. Hi, she grinned. Alan turned up the dimmer switch to full. Are you okay, honey? He asked with tender concern. Course I am. She turned off the dryer. Then why wouldn't you let me in here? Madison gazed up and down Alan's taut, muscular frame. I'm shy, she whispered seductively, grasping the towel as it stirred slightly. Alan's fine eyebrows shot up in mock astonishment. Shy? He gasped. You were shy? After the police station and in the car and the elevator and the bedroom and on top of the refrigerator? You're shy? She winked and smiled up at him. Then she drew the towel away from her legs, stood up and slipped out, touching him with her fingers as she passed. I was shy, Alan, yes. Alan looked at her long back and tumbling hair, and then shook his head at his reflection in the mirror. She was shy, he echoed, switching off the light and following her into the bedroom. Chapter 12. With fanatical determination, Walter Kornbluth had searched the depths of the bay for 3 days, convinced that he had seen what he had seen, and resolved to prove it to the skeptics of the orthodox scientific establishment with whom he had waged a long-running feud concerning his wild theories. But he had failed to rediscover the elusive golden creature he had tried to photograph 2 days previously, and now circumstances seemed to be conspiring to frustrate his mission. He was staggering about on the seabed, blue around the lips and gasping for air, tugging frantically on his umbilical and staring through misted-up spectacles and visor at the unresponsive keel of the hired tugboat above, yelling for help and deafening himself inside the helmet. Eventually he gave up and started hauling himself hand over hand up the sturdy air hose. After what seemed an eternity, he broke surface and ripped off his mask, gulping the fresh air as if each gulp were his last. When he had revived a little, he dragged himself up the ladder and clambered onto the deck. His 2-man crew were reclining in deck chairs, one reading a tabloid newspaper with slowly moving lips, the other fast asleep in the sunshine beside the wheezing air pump apparatus. Hey, Brain, Kornbluth shouted. The elder brother woke up and opened one eye. You see this hose? Kornbluth went on, shaking the bright yellow pipe at him. This is so I can breathe. The boy closed his eye and nodded his complete agreement. You want to get your damn deck chair off it, then? Walter screamed breathlessly, yanking the tube which was flattened under the frame of the chair. Lazily, the lanky boy shifted the chair without even glancing down at the trapped hose. Meanwhile, his younger brother painstakingly read out a headline from the newspaper. Beauty bears all at Statue of Liberty. The tall boy got up and wandered over to look over his shoulder. Kornbluth divested himself of camera, knife, torch, and sundry items of equipment, still breathing heavily. Why are you reading that stuff? He demanded. The boy looked up blankly. Don't know. Kornbluth flung down his helmet. What the hell possesses the uneducated to purchase these things? He raved, as though venting all his frustration of the past few days. It's interesting, grunted the grim-faced older boy, reading the report with googling eyes. Kornbluth flapped across to them in his outsized scuba suit. You are not helping yourselves, he castigated them severely. This is not news. He snatched the tabloid from Junior. Gimme this. You know what's in here, he growled. Nothing. You have sex, you have perversion, it's all just fabrication. Walter flourished the photograph of Madison standing among the admiring sightseers beneath the statue. Look at this. A naked woman at the Statue of Liberty, he scoffed, flinging the paper onto the deck and stamping awkwardly back to his pile of gear. Where would they find a girl to do that? The boys grabbed the paper and studied the blooming nipples thrusting through the luscious hair. Right here in Cod, grinned the younger lad, nudging his brother. Something occurred to Walter. He slithered to a halt on the slippery deck and chewed the arm of his spectacles thoughtfully. "Here, let me see that again," he suddenly shouted, wading back to them through the clutter of equipment and crates littering the deck. He seized the paper and read the article quickly through a couple of times, his black eyes glinting with eager anticipation at every line. Then he looked up at the grinning pair, his eyes fixed in a rigid stare of manic intensity. "Take me back to the shore," he eventually commanded in a hoarse whisper. "Get me back to the shore, now!" Late that afternoon, Alan came home carrying a box wrapped in silvery gift paper and tied up in a bow with a scarlet ribbon. He peered round the front door, holding the box behind his back. To his distress, he saw that Madison was sitting hunched on the bed, staring at the television with tears cascading down her cheeks. "Hey, Madison, honey? Madison, what is it?" he murmured, shutting the door and sitting down beside her. He cradled her shaking body in his arms. "What happened?" he asked gently, as she sobbed uncontrollably into his shoulder. "It's just the saddest thing I ever saw," she stammered out, pointing at the TV screen. Alan glanced round. "But it's Bonanza," he laughed. "But a man killed another man, and he died right in the middle of the street." Alan shook his head reassuringly. No, this is only television," he explained. "I thought you understood about TV. It's only make-believe, honey." Alan went over and touched the screen. "Look, this is another pretend killing that's going on now. This guy here is an actor, and next week he'll get shot in some other show, or he might shoot somebody himself. See?" He went back and sat beside her again, stroking her face and her hair. "When you think about it, it's kind of funny," he grinned. Madison stopped crying. She frowned at him. "You mean I'm supposed to laugh?" Alan nodded. "Sure you are, sweetheart." Madison looked back at the screen and sniffled. Then she managed a little chuckle at her foolishness. Alan leaned forward and kissed the tears from her eyes. Then he picked up the box from the bed and held it out. "There you go. I just got you something." Madison took the pretty box and gazed at it fondly. Then she kissed it. "It's beautiful, Alan. I love it," she murmured. Alan pointed to the scarlet bow. "You have to open it." She looked surprised and even more delighted. "There's more?" she whispered. He nodded. Excitedly, she tore off the wrapping and opened the cardboard box. Inside was an ornamental musical box. A miniature lady and gentleman dressed in 18th century costume stood facing each other with hands joined underneath a glass dome. Alan showed Madison how to press the button on the base. There was a whirring sound, and the two little figures started moving around one another in a dignified dance, while tinkling music issued from the hollow base. Madison watched spellbound until the graceful figures gradually slowed down and stopped, and the music jerked into silence. "It's so lovely, Alan," she said, her eyes shining. He shook his head, as if unable to believe in the little figure in her fetching pink dress, with tiny flowers sitting next to him. He took her hand. "So are you," he whispered. "So are you." In the evening they went out on the town and then walked hand in hand along by the river. The Hudson looked dark and forbidding as it swirled by the embankment. In a small riverside gardens they came upon a floodlit fountain consisting of a green copper mermaid perched on a rock and embracing fish. In the distance, a man was playing Bach sonatas on a battered violin. They stood and listened to the lonely melodies and watched the bright water cascading down into the basin of the fountain. After a while, Madison asked Alan if he liked the fountain, as if she sensed that it was a special landmark for him. "Yeah, I do," he said. "I don't know why, really. Just something about it. It always appealed to me ever since I was a kid." Madison nestled closer to him. "Do you like the sea, Alan?" He thought for a few moments. "No, I don't. When I was about 8 years old, I had this accident. It was on a boat and I... Yes, I remember, she told him very quietly. Alan pulled away slightly and stared at her. What? Her face was in shadow. No, I forget the words, Madison went on hurriedly. I understand, she corrected herself, smiling apologetically. Did you get hurt? No, I didn't. I was lucky, Alan murmured, a faraway look creeping into his eyes as he gazed at the copper mermaid on her rock. But when I was under the water, I thought... Yes, she breathed, almost sighing wistfully. I could have sworn I saw... What did you see, Alan? He shook his head. Nothing. It was nothing. He moved away, hands thrust in pockets, as if he were trying to forget rather than trying to remember. I was just a stupid kid, he insisted. Madison followed him round the shimmering basin beneath the fountain. You know, they're going to destroy this park, Alan suddenly burst out angrily. They want to build some load of riverfront apartments or some such nonsense. Tear all this out. He gestured round the little park and shrugged. Madison glanced back at the jade-colored mermaid on her rock. Alan seemed preoccupied and remote. She slipped her hand in his once more. Hey, honey, what do you want to do now? He grinned, coming to life again. You want to go home? Madison glanced up at the moon hanging over the World Trade Center. She saw, with regret, that it was a little fuller than last night. She shook her head emphatically. No, Alan, I have 5 days left. Alan turned suddenly to grasp her slim shoulders with possessive hands. No, sweetheart. I mean my home. Home with me, he said tenderly. Madison fondled his ears, and they kissed. Yes, she said, home. Alan had forgotten about the moon, but he was on the brink of asking about the 5 days left business and all the many other things he did not understand. But gazing into Madison's eyes, he wasn't sure whether he wanted or needed to understand. Not yet, anyway. And then she kissed him again, and the man played Bach until they went home. Chapter 13. Next morning, Alan met Freddie at the Rackets Club. His big brother talked endlessly about his plans for the business as he struggled out of his suit, hustling and bustling with ambition. By contrast, Alan had been letting his grip on Ralph Bauer and Sons slip badly during the past 2 days, and he felt guilty but helpless in the face of Madison's relentless attractions. Why do we want to go to some goddamn political dinner? Alan demanded as they changed in the locker room for their squash game. Freddie zipped up the front of his purple tracksuit and patted his stomach comfortingly. Because the president will be speaking there, that's why, he explained, picking up his half-smoked cigar off the radiator. Alan dragged himself out of his tight jeans. The president of what? Freddie rested his small head against the metal door of the locker and gently banged it. The president of the United States! Alan pulled on some snazzy silk shorts. No kidding? Freddie loomed closer and winked. We'll be rubbing shoulders with the big shots, I tell ya, he confided. You think big, you be big. Alan glanced significantly at Freddie's vast frame stretching the tracksuit zips almost to breaking. I guess so, he admitted grudgingly. He went on changing in silence while Freddie puffed dreamily at his cigar and fiddled with the cooler box he'd brought, stacked full of Budweiser. Listen, Freddie, would you mind if I took Madison to this dinner thing instead of going with you? Alan asked eventually. His brother burst into a raucous roar of laughter. Freddie clutched at his heart with both hands. Something in here's not working, he mocked. Oh, I'll never fall in love, Freddie. I can't. It won't work with me, he cried, capering like a vaudeville lover. Alan laced up his sports shoes. Who said anything about me being in love? He snapped. Freddie snorted. Ha! You haven't been to work for 2 days. That's an exaggeration. Admit it, baby, Freddie insisted gleefully. No, Alan snapped petulantly. Freddie suddenly reached out and grabbed him in a playful headlock, and they careered around the echoing locker room like a couple of all-in wrestlers. "The eye gouge," Freddie announced dramatically, miming with his stubby fingers. "Come on, admit it." "No." "The bone crusher," Freddie threatened. Alan fell to the floor, feigning death. 10 minutes later, they were battling it out in the squash court. Behind the glass wall, fashionably kitted out cognoscenti watched them with sour, humorless contempt as they lounged about with fruit juices. Alan darted nimbly all round the court, while Freddie lumbered around in the middle with a cigar clamped between his teeth, swinging viciously at every ball and breathing like an ancient steam locomotive. After a while, Freddie staggered back against the wall, his sweatband resembling a collapsed halo. "How long we been playing?" he panted. "About 5 minutes," Alan replied chirpily, diving for a difficult return. "Oh, God," Freddie gasped, blowing through the cigar and bending down to reach into the cooler basket in the corner. "My heart's beating like a rabbit. You want a beer?" "No, thanks." Freddie unzipped the can and swigged mightily away, seating himself thankfully on the lid of the cooler and watching Alan thrusting and pawing with lithe grace on his own. "So tell me this, Alan," Freddie puffed. "If you're not in love with that girl, why do all these little things she does drive you so goddamn crazy?" Alan reached, missed the ball, and then wandered over to him in the corner. "Little things, Freddie?" he protested. "The girl learned to speak English in a single afternoon." Freddie shrugged. "So? She probably could speak English already. I think she must have been in shock from being arrested." Alan retrieved the ball and served stylishly. "Well, what about that, Freddie? I mean, what about a woman showing up naked in a public place?" he challenged, making a split-second shot behind his back. Freddie smiled broadly. "Well, I'm all for it, of course." Perched on the cooler, he watched Alan punishing himself while he puffed and swigged noisily. "You said she had some kind of immigration problem," he brooded. "Maybe she was on an ocean liner in the middle of the Atlantic, and she sees America and it looks good. So she greases her body up like some channel swimmer and dives in. She goes through some sharks, maybe. Trouble there. Goes through the Coast Guard and some minefields, and then she's on shore and she's okay. Miss Liberty," Freddie concluded triumphantly. Alan smashed ball after ball round the walls, emphasizing his words with each powerful stroke. "Well, what about the bathtub and the moon stuff, and what about all those TVs?" Freddie brooded again. "Okay, I'm being serious," he resumed morosely. "I mean, I've had a few fiascos in my own love life, and—" Alan stopped in his tracks, leaving the ball to rocket off the walls until it finally trickled into a corner. "Freddie, you took a date to one of your own weddings," he shouted derisively. His brother glared up at him. "Know what your problem is, my son? You're in love with the girl, and you're trying to convince yourself you're not." Alan stood in front of him, his arms hanging loosely, shaking his head in despair. "I just don't know, Freddie. It's something about it that just isn't right, that's all," he mumbled. Freddie heaved himself to his feet and lumbered over to get the ball. "I'll serve, you hold the beer," he suggested. "That'll be your handicap." Alan took the can absently. "Oh, we're going to play?" "Yeah, I'm going to teach you a lesson in humility," Freddie told him. He lined himself up to serve, his chubby face set with the concentration of a champion, carefully judging the shot. "Okay, humility, 1-on-1. All set?" Alan skipped lightly on his toes in readiness. "Yeah." "Then here we go." Freddie hit the ball a blistering thwack. It rebounded viciously, flew back, and hit him in the head like a shell. Freddie groaned with disappointment and keeled over onto his face like a huge, soft toy bear. At that very moment, in the American Museum of Natural History just across the city, an ugly confrontation was taking place in the conference room. Despite the sober, rational atmosphere evoked by the tall arched windows, the massive polished mahogany table with its rows of turquoise-shaded, brass, Art Nouveau lamps, and the glass-fronted book and specimen cases lining the walls from floor to ceiling, tempers were melting and voices cracking with angry indignation. At the bottom of the table stood Walter Kornbluth, dressed in green corduroy suit, checked shirt, and woolen tie. He was staring fixedly at the 2 rows of figures seated down either side of the table, at American, European, African, and Oriental faces, both male and female, all of them alert and reasonable, and above all, expert. At the far end, seated at the head of the august assembly, was Dr. Ross, the curator of paleontology. Ross was sharp and acid, with pale gray eyes, a clipped gray mustache, and a gray suit. His bow tie was a ghastly green. Ross had listened to Kornbluth until he could listen no longer. He peered at the impudent upstart at the other end of the table, his mouth twisted in a tight warp of contempt. "So this is what we all came to hear?" he exclaimed in a dry, rasping voice. "You call us and you tell us that you have made a discovery that will stretch the frontiers of paleontology and zoology with epoch-making certainty?" The voice began to rise and sharpen. "And we all interrupt important and serious work to fly here at a moment's notice?" The voice reached a shrill, corrosive intensity. "And today you give us mermaids?" All heads turned to stare at Kornbluth, showing masks of outrage, pity, and stupefaction. There was a chasm of silence in the vast chamber. Then Dr. Ross sprang to his feet. He was a surprisingly short man. "Don't call us," he hissed malevolently down the gleaming blade of mahogany. "Call that's incredible." And with that he snatched up his briefcase and marched tight-lipped out of the room. As the other academics followed Ross in hostile silence, Walter realized that a solitary man had remained seated midway along the table. The man was staring at Walter over his half-moon spectacles, his unkempt silver hair and permanently raised eyebrows, giving him an otherworldly appearance. The man wore a shabby cardigan and a lapsed bow tie. Under the table he sported a pair of carpet slippers. He watched Walter sink slowly into his chair and bury his face in his hands. Then he got up and shuffled down the empty, echoing conference chamber towards him. "What happened to you, Kornbluth? You were the brightest student in my class," he recalled in a weary, disillusioned voice. "True, emotionally you were only 12 years old. Professor Zedel, I was only 12 years old." Walter retorted through his fingers. That's right, Walter, and look what you've turned into, a schmuck." Walter remained motionless. "There was a mermaid in New York City," he stated categorically. Professor Zedel picked up the copy of the Cape Cod Courier from the pile on the table in front of his disgraced ex-student. "You mean this naked girl here? Well, how come this mermaid's got legs?" Walter's head snapped upright. "She has legs out of the water. She has fins in the water," he shouted. "You taught me that, Professor. Don't you remember? You taught me all the legends. You used to bring me into your office and show me those charts on the walls of where sailors had reported they saw mermaids." Professor closed his eyes and made a kind of sighing noise between his gold teeth. "Walter, that was just for fun," he explained patiently. "It was for relaxation, not for you to build your whole life on." Walter jumped up, snatching the Courier from Zedel's frail grasp and the other newspapers from the table. "I am going to prove to you and all those other intellectual dinosaurs that the girl is a mermaid," he vowed hoarsely, turning and making for the door. "How?" the professor called skeptically after him. "Are you going to get her wet so that everyone sees she's really got fins?" Walter paused with his hand poised over the ornate brass door handle shaped like a mermaid. Then he smiled secretively and rushed out of the museum. Chapter 14. That afternoon, Alan came home early again, and as he walked out of the lift, whistling cheerfully, he was surprised to see the door to his apartment wide open. Workmen in overalls were backing out with a small trolley, and some light scaffolding was piled in the hallway outside. Alan ran down the hallway, his carefree expression abruptly replaced by a grim look of foreboding. Madison looked startled and then overjoyed to see him as she met him in the doorway wearing a dazzling white trouser suit, which added a touch of elegance to her wild beauty. "Alan, you're home," she sang out, embracing him fiercely on the threshold. Alan gestured around in bewilderment. What the hell's going on round here, sweetheart? He gasped. Madison put her hands over his eyes. I got you a present, Alan, she whispered tantalizingly. But don't look. Promise you won't look, she warned him. What? Well, just wait a... Alan stuttered as a vast laborer covered in dust squeezed past, winking knowingly at him. Listen, honey, I gotta close the door. Madison grasped the collar of his wind cheater and drew him seductively into the apartment. What are you doing? He protested, kicking the door shut with his foot. All right, I won't look. Madison took his hands. Promise, she whispered. Alan promised, closing his eyes and following her impatiently through into the bedroom area. He heard the mysterious splashing of water. Are we going to take a bath? He asked. Madison paused. Okay, Alan, you can look now. Alan opened his eyes. Almost immediately he shut them again and gasped. Then he opened them. There was a long silence. Yeah, he finally managed to croak. Yeah, well, that's big. It's really big, and it's really here. In front of him, taking up most of the living room, was the copper mermaid fountain from the gardens, complete with the basin and water streaming down the statuary. Alan sat heavily on the edge of the bed and stared at the prodigious gift, assuming that in a moment or two he would mercifully wake up from this nightmare. Madison knelt behind him and put her arms round his shoulders and her head against his, anxiously waiting for his approval. It's just so big, he laughed nervously, still stunned. You told me they were going to tear it down, so I bought it for you, Madison told him. It's yours now. Alan blinked and nodded and gulped. Honey, where did you get the money to pay for a thing like this? He murmured, the brutal reality of the thing only just beginning to sink in. Madison kissed the top of his head and kept silent. Alan felt her breasts against his shoulder blades and then realized something was missing. Madison, not your beautiful necklace, he cried, twisting round to look. Her neck was bare. She nodded solemnly. I traded it for the statue. Why, sweetheart? Why? Because I love you, Alan. He got up and slowly walked around the statue, trailing his fingers in the water. The jade-colored mermaid smiled down at him as he watched the water dripping from her breasts. He smiled up at her smiling face. Then he rushed over and knelt beside Madison. Listen, Madison, I love the present. I love the present, and I love you, he murmured fervently, taking her delighted face and kissing it all over and laughing with all his heart. And I love you, she whispered. As they kissed again, her eyes wandered to the mermaid, and a wistful sadness passed over her face. She drew a little away from him as if to tell him some painful thought that had just come into her mind. Alan smiled back inquiringly, but Madison kept silent, her fingers beginning to undo the buttons of his shirt as he slipped the jacket from her shoulders, murmuring quietly. A little persistent inquiring, plus a few dollars distributed shrewdly here and there at the precinct headquarters and at the newspaper offices, had yielded information which had led Walter Kornbluth to park his car across the street from Alan's apartment. Now he was waiting for his prey, tense with expectation. Behind him on the floor in the back of the car sat 2 tin buckets filled with water and covered with lids. At long last, Alan and Madison emerged and got into a cab. Walter trailed them across to Fifth Avenue, where they paid off the driver outside St. Patrick's Cathedral and set out on foot northwards towards the park. Walter curb-crawled along behind them as they window-shopped in innocent oblivion. Near Tiffany's, the couple wandered into a shoe store, and Walter parked illegally nearby. Slinging a 35mm camera and lens case round his neck, he scrambled out, dodging the dense traffic passing around the obstruction he had created. Keeping one eye on the bustling sidewalk outside the crowded shops, he opened the rear offside door, knocked the lids off the buckets, and hauled the brimming pails out of the car. Kicking the door shut, he staggered around onto the sidewalk, weighed down into a Groucho Marx posture, and fought his way through the passers-by, just as the blue-coated, long-haired girl on the arm of the gray-flanneled and blue-blazered young man came out of the shop and turned along the avenue towards Tiffany's. Slopping water right and left, Cornbluth stumbled between the elegant shoppers, keeping his eyes glued to his quarry as they stopped and admired the displays in Tiffany's famous windows. He crept up close behind them, put down one bucket, flung the contents of the other bucket over the girl's legs, and quickly repeated the routine with the first bucket. Then, with buckets clattering and rolling around his feet, he snatched up the camera and focused with fiendish concentration on the girl's dripping wet knees. With a startled scream, the girl turned round. So did her escort. Cornbluth waited excitedly, forefinger poised over the button, the shapely calves sharply in focus in his viewfinder. But nothing happened. The expected metamorphosis failed to occur. Then everything went momentarily black as a large hand wrenched the camera from his grasp. Walter found himself staring at a thick-necked quarterback with a broken nose, who seized him by the throat and shook him. "Hey, what do you think you're doing, Four Eyes?" bellowed the man. In the background, Walter just glimpsed a completely unfamiliar girl in a blue coat. She was sobbing with shock and indignation. "Oh, my God," Walter stammered, clutching frenziedly at his assailant's fingers in a vain attempt to prise them off his windpipe. Then everything seemed to whirl crazily round and up and down, while voices yelled and laughed and gigantic metal bells clanged against his head. Finally, everything went black again with a sickening thud. Chapter 15. Totally unaware of their narrow escape that afternoon, Alan and Madison ended up in a smart, rather pretentious restaurant close to the Rockefeller Center for an early dinner. Alan sat toying with the cutlery, preoccupied and silent. Madison was, as usual, taking in her surroundings with unflagging and alert perceptiveness. Happily, she fingered the tasteful modern necklace Alan had bought her at Tiffany's to replace the beautiful treasure she had sacrificed in her desire to make him love her, and she kept turning round to attract the attention of neighboring diners to her new adornment. In her low-cut pink dress with tiny flowers and matching wrap, she looked quite ravishing. Now and again she gazed at Alan, puzzled by his remoteness, but uncertain how to woo him out of it. There were still so many things she did not understand about the new world she found herself increasingly at home in, and she desperately wanted to avoid causing unhappiness by behaving in the wrong way. While they waited for the entree, Alan balanced a teaspoon on his finger and tapped the end of the handle, seeing how far he could make it swing without falling off. Suddenly there was a flash of bright metal and a clatter as the spoon flew across the tables and hit the wall between an elderly couple who were eating snails in a corner. "Oops," Alan said, with an insolent grin as mild protest rose around them. "Nice earrings," he called over to the woman, whose ears were sagging with hideous Victorian ironmongery. The couple glared back over their escargot a la Nixon. Madison took Alan's restless fingers in hers. "Is there something wrong?" she murmured. He smiled with artificial readiness. No, nothing at all," he replied unconvincingly. There was a pause. Alan fidgeted again. "You know, I was thinking, Madison, you don't have to leave this country," he told her eventually. "Yes, I do." No. You see, there's all kinds of stuff we can do," Alan assured her earnestly, with more than a touch of desperation in his voice. "I mean, to get around the immigration laws. For instance, I could give you a job down at the market. We could get you a work permit." He paused, searching Madison's face for some sign of assent or approval. "Then you could, well, marry. Like, marry an American. Then they'd have to let you stay," he added, in a sudden eager rush of words, seizing her hands. A fleeting look of regret passed over Madison's serene face as she listened. She kept looking up from his hands into his face, as if she were on the brink of revealing something, but Alan interpreted her hesitant silence as a refusal. He shook his head defeatedly, as if struggling to banish tears. Just then, the overdressed bogus French waiter wheeled up their dinner on a trolley. Look, our food is here, exclaimed Madison, gazing hungrily at the two glazed lobsters with sudden enthusiasm. Alan grinned bravely. Oh, well, I guess we can talk about it later, he sighed. The obsequious waiter served them with elaborate gestures. Do be careful, madame, he pouted. This plate is very hot. Alan waved him away. Thank you, these look terrific. Madison picked up her lobster entire and took an enormous bite, crunching right through the shell. Alan stared at her in amazement. She grinned back, murmuring appreciatively as she devoured the flesh and the shell together. Alan glanced around in acute embarrassment. Gradually, the other diners had stopped eating and were sitting gaping at the extraordinary woman as she proceeded to tear the lobster apart with her flashing teeth in wild relish. On the days, the black pianist played slower and slower with a rash of wrong notes. Waiters turned in mid-flourish and goggled incredulously at the crackling, crunching beauty with the long hair and the thrusting breasts. Alan picked up his fork and tinkered with his own food as if nothing unusual were happening, but the noise Madison was making could not be ignored. He grinned and nodded casually at the adjacent tables, gesturing with his fork and shaking his head at Madison. Boy, he intimated wryly, boy, is she hungry. Madison nodded earnestly at him in reply and attacked the remains of her crustacean with even more furious gusto, wiping her mouth with the back of her hand and licking her fingers as she consumed every last morsel on her plate. After dinner, they went to a small outdoor skating rink near the United Nations building. Alan led Madison carefully onto the ice, but she soon slipped his grasp and took off solo, gliding and turning with effortless ease, her pink cheeks charmingly matching the colors in her billowing dress. She reminded Alan irresistibly of the little lady on the music box as they met and separated, approached and departed in the cold night air like figures in a fairy story. He was astonished at Madison's graceful skill, which was quite baffling in an apparent beginner. Several times he stopped and watched her open-mouthed as she pirouetted brilliantly for his benefit among the dozen or so other skaters. They sat down for a breather on one of the benches. Hey, baby, you are very, very good, Alan murmured, his face shining with admiration. Madison kissed him, and he held her close for a moment. Let's you and me talk, he suggested gently. Your nose is cold, she teased, as if to distract him. He tweaked her chin. I don't want to talk about my nose. She burst into peals of laughter, pointing at his head. Your ears are all red, she giggled. Alan squirmed self-consciously. I don't want to discuss any part of myself, he warned her severely. Madison fell silent and looked serious suddenly. But I do want to talk about what happened back there in the restaurant. There was a long pause. Madison bowed her head guiltily. At last she looked up. I'm sorry, Alan. That's how we eat lobster where I come from, she said shamefacedly. No, I don't care about that, Alan retorted. No, you see, I was trying to do something back there, and I guess I did it very badly. He hesitated, glancing at the happy throng of skaters. I was trying to ask if you wanted to get married. Madison sat gazing up at the nearby rounded moon as streamers of cloud trailed across it. She said nothing. Alan took her face in his hands. Madison, will you marry me? She shook her head immediately. No. Alan slowly took his hands away, staring at her with dulled eyes. What? Just no? You don't want to think about it? About what I just asked you? Weigh the pros and cons? You don't want to kick it around for a while? He exclaimed sarcastically. She looked away. I can't marry you, Alan. Why not? I can't tell you. Alan stared bleakly at the skaters for a while. Look, I know you think you have some great big secret you think you can't tell me, but you can tell me, he persisted. Madison kept silent. What is it? You're already married? Alan, or you're dying? You're gay? You're crazy? You were once a man? Whatever it is, I don't care. You can tell me." She turned to him in a panic, her eyes glistening. "Alan, I only have 3 days left. Please make them wonderful," she implored. At last he turned back to her. "Okay," he said simply. "Want to skate some more?" He nodded. Madison glided thankfully out onto the ice and performed a series of spectacular pirouettes for him. But Alan blatantly ignored her and stood virtually still, watching a couple of about 60 skating sedately and joyfully around the rink. Madison executed a clever turn beside him. "You know those people?" she asked. "No," Alan replied, still watching them. "I've just seen them here before. I guess they've been coming here together for about 40 years. She watched them. "They look very happy," she murmured. Alan swung abruptly round on her. "Well now, why shouldn't they be happy?" he demanded harshly. "They get to spend their whole lives together, don't they?" Alan skated furiously away from her, bombing recklessly round the ice close to the wooden barriers. Madison set off after him and quickly caught him up. "Is this really what happens to water when it gets cold?" she asked, as if nothing had happened between them. "Yeah. Where I come from, it never gets cold," she laughed. "Hey, well, what a break for whatever that is," Alan snapped viciously. Madison glided back to the benches and sat down again. Suddenly she looked alone and vulnerable. Alan did a few more circuits, gradually calming himself down. Then he skated over to her. "You know, you just really opened up to me back there," he told her. "You opened up for the first time." Madison was tugging at the laces of her skates. "Your voice sounds funny," she mumbled, blushing brightly. Alan stood over her, hands on hips. "Yeah, well, it's called sarcasm," he spat brutally. "But I suppose they don't have that where you come from either." "No," she whimpered, fighting back the tears as she pulled off the skates. Alan glared down at her, determined to hurt her. "They don't have ice, they don't have music, they don't have sarcasm. Just what kind of a goddamn place is it, Madison?" he shouted. Throwing the skates down, Madison jumped up and ran quickly out of the rink enclosure. Yelling her name over and over again, Alan tried to go after her, tottering clumsily on the skates. But she didn't pause or even glance back at him once. As he reached the admission booth, the attendant grabbed his arm. "Hey, Mac, those skates are rented." Alan wriggled free. "Just give me 1 second," he shouted aggressively, tripping over the skates as he stumbled through the turnstile and clattered after the swiftly running figure in the distance. "Madison, Madison, I'm sorry, sweetheart," he yelled pathetically. Next moment the attendant had brought him down with a flying tackle, and they were rolling along the boardwalk, struggling viciously. The attendant started to untie the skate. "Let her go, Mac," he advised sourly. "Show some dignity, for Christ's sakes." But Alan was aware only of the fleeting figure of his precious lady from the sea, receding irretrievably from his grasp into the night as spots of rain began to fall, pattering more and more thickly until they formed into a torrential downpour. Overhead, the moon was hidden from human eyes.